This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. Javier Milei has already backed off some of his more radical policy positions since winning the election on November 19th. How should we understand this apparent evolution? And what are Argentina's biggest challenges moving forward?
I think there are three personalities. There is the original Milei, who was an introvert with relatively low personal skills. And then he created this character. The character was extremely popular, particularly in the social networks and not in TV, but on an underground level with young people. But that character cannot be the president, nor the other one. So he needs to create a new one, and that's the one that's still underdeveloped.
It was always the biggest question of Argentina's presidential campaign. Was the Javier Milei who called himself an anarcho-capitalist, who wielded a chainsaw to demonstrate what he'd do to the Argentine state, who vowed to dollarize the Argentine economy, even though Argentina's central bank effectively doesn't have any dollars, who called Brazil's president a corrupt communist, who called Pope Francis, the Argentine Pope, a filthy leftist? Was that all the real Javier Milei? Or would he evolve, at least somewhat, after winning the election and facing the very real task of governing an Argentina riven by economic and political crisis? Well, as we record this, it does look like there's a pivot of sorts going on. Milei seems to be suggesting, with both his words and personnel appointments, that dollarization will take a while, if it happens at all. He sent a letter to Brazil's President Lula inviting him to his inauguration, and he even had a cordial conversation by phone with Pope Francis. So what does this tell us? What are the forces leading Milei to adopt a somewhat more pragmatic tack, at least in some areas? What are the biggest risks facing the country as Milei vows shock treatment to reduce the size of the Argentine state? What will Milei do when faced with the deeper structural challenges that Argentina faces, from a divided Congress to a struggling education system to the very real risk of political unrest as austerity measures move forward? Today, we've brought someone who can speak to all of these questions, the near-term political analysis, as well as a clear view of Argentina's long-term challenges. That guest is Eduardo Levy Yeyati. He is a professor at the School of Government at Torcuato di Tella University in Buenos Aires. He's a member of AQ's editorial board, and he was also, we should note, an advisor for the center-right coalition that came in third in the first round of elections, the Juntos por el Cambio bloc. Eduardo, welcome back to the AQ podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Eduardo, as we record this, there is still so much that is up in the air and undefined. But that said, what are your impressions of Javier Milei since he was elected?
Preliminarily, what you can say is that many of the main mottos of the campaign are being postponed or de-emphasized in favor of more traditional proposals or no proposal at all. Because, for instance, in the case of dollarization, which was one of his slogans, there seems to be, at the time of this talk, no alternative plan on the table because the people who were in charge of dollarization should resign or went back home, and the new guys they don't come with a plan. So it's very little what we can say. What we can see is that many of the original ideas are being, as I said, postponed or toned down in favor of something that's still imprecise.
But do you have the impression that this new set of policy priorities that is beginning to emerge is more realistic? I mean, what do you think what's your sense of what's happening behind the scenes?
I think it is realistic to drop the dollarization plan, because simply the country doesn't have the dollars to pursue dollarization in a reasonable way. So nothing's going to happen in the next 12 months. And the priorities are essentially focused on the next 12 months. So that's realistic. I think it's a reality check. Now, the direction which they are moving still to be seen, because you have to bear in mind that in the last week, we went over at least 4 different names for the Minister of Economics and the Central Bank. And these 4 names have different ideas.
Well, I should note that as we record this, as you said, that position is still unfilled. But these notes of a certain pragmatism on the economic side have been accompanied by signs of potential pragmatism on the foreign policy front. For example, Milei sent a letter to Brazil's president, Lula, whom he described as a corrupt communist in the weeks leading up to the election, essentially appealing to his sense of the importance of ties between Argentina and Brazil and inviting him to his inauguration. We have also just learned, as we record this, that during his half-day trip to New York, Milei chose to have lunch with, of all people, Bill Clinton. And so was he more pragmatic than he led us to believe during the campaign?
I think so. I mean, first of all, you have to bear in mind that particularly our listeners, that anything that's been said in a campaign, at least in Argentina, I think it's more general, but in Argentina at least, it needs to be taken with a grain of salt, more than one grain, because, both dollarization, what Milei called the motosierra, which is essentially a very drastic, draconian fiscal adjustment, are things that were very appealing during the campaign. But even during the campaign, even at that time, I'm pretty sure Milei thought, or somebody around him thought, that was too much for the first year. So this is politics. A little bit blunt for American perspectives, but still it's politics.
Well, we've certainly had our experience with blunt presidents, to use your word, here in the United States. And this is my last question about Milei, the person here, trying to understand him so far. Eduardo, I keep coming back to this thing that I heard very early in the Argentine campaign from someone who had worked with Javier Milei in a professional capacity. This person said, well, actually in private, he's a very, eccentric individual, but quite reasonable. And this person said, my impression is that he formulated a personality for television that may have escaped a little bit from his hands. He wouldn't be the first person in history that's happened to. And this person said, if he was to get elected, he would probably be more like the private person who's actually a bit more reasonable. What's your sense on that question?
I will answer that with less conviction that I would, if you talk about central bank policy, because it has to do more with psychology, really. I studied psychology, but I'm not a psychologist. So having said that, I think there are 3 personalities. There is the original Milei, who was an introvert with relatively low personal skills, not a gregarious person, and a technocrat, in a sense. It's a very simplistic way of characterizing him, but essentially was a desk guy working with numbers. And then he created this character. The character was extremely popular, particularly in streaming, in the social networks, and not in TV, but more on an underground level and with young people. But that character cannot be the president, nor the other one. So he needs to create a new one. And that's the one that's still underdeveloped. The statesman, right? Because he cannot go back to valuing companies, which was one of the things that he was doing as a professional economist before. And he cannot go back to, say, very aggressive, very violent things to, call
the
attention.
chainsaw.
He already has all the attention he needs. Now he needs to manage something. He never did that before. And he needs to be more gregarious in the sense of politically, diplomatically close to people, right? To important people. So he's moving that direction, but still not there. And that's a big enigma, whether he will develop this personality that is more associated with professional politician, particularly a chief of state.
Okay, so let's broaden the lens a little bit and get beyond the person and look at what really matters, which is the country. What is, in your mind, the biggest, most urgent challenge that Javier Milei will face?
The necessary condition, the problem that needs to be solved in order for all the other things to fall into place is nominal stability, is inflation, is the realignment of the exchange rate without causing a spiral that leads to hyperinflation that in turn debilitates, weakens the government and inhibits all the other reforms. So there is a sequence. So the first thing you have to do is to undo this nominal fragility and avoid, among other things, a bank run, a hyperinflation, a currency run that might lead to very high inflation. Once you do that, you have two advantages. The first one is you gain a lot of political support because nobody was actually believing that you're going to do that in 6 months or in 12 months. The second one, you actually open the door for many other reforms. You cannot think of a social security reform. You cannot think of going back to voluntary capital markets without sorting out first the nominal stability problem. If you don't have access to capital markets, you will run into a default in 2 years' time. If you don't reform the social security system, you will run into fiscal deficit in 5 years. So there is a natural chain. The first thing is nominal stability, and that's why it's so important the Minister of Economics / central bank tandem right now.
One thing that has struck me over the last couple months as I have tried to refocus a bit on Argentina is that as bad as the Argentine economy is, and we all know the headline numbers with the 140% inflation, poverty at 40%, possibly higher and rising, you look under the surface and it's actually much worse. I mean, even this tenuous status quo has been supported by lending both domestically and internationally from the IMF and from China that is unsustainable. And so, the trajectory of this thing could get so much worse in a very short period of time if he gets this sequence wrong.
I agree. I used to say that we are facing a binary scenario because things can get much worse and can get much better. The only scenario that's, to my view, unsustainable is current state, the status quo. You cannot go like this forever. So something might happen. You either deteriorate very dramatically or you rebound because people think, okay, this time is different. And there are a number of upsides that we haven't exploited yet that are still there. We're facing a crossroads, really. And the only thing for sure is that you cannot go from one short-time solution to the next one for another 12 months.
Let me ask you, and keeping in mind this is more of a political podcast than an economics podcast, so we don't want to get too technical here, but at the end of the day, isn't the challenge that Javier Milei faces on the economic front about ajuste, about cutting the size of the state to put it in line with what Argentina is able to afford, and therefore then the political risk of a backlash from the street and from society, as we've seen during previous attempts at austerity in Argentina's both distant and recent past? Is that it at the end of the day?
That's a big part of it. There are also technical issues that you have to sort out. But politically, from the broader picture, you need to, let's say, reconcile your resources with your spending. So you're spending more than what you can afford, and you're actually getting increasingly indebted to keep on your current spending level, which is
and
the
printing
hole
money.
Exactly. So you're digging the hole, even a deeper hole. In addition to that, you need to distribute the costs. And that's where politics is important, because if you are going to fight against the labor, for instance, as the unions, but not against the exemptions that many businessmen receive, important exemptions. 0.5% of GDP is going to, say, subsidies for industrial promotion that goes to very few big oligopolistic players. So if you don't touch that, or if you devalue the exchange rate. We should do without compensating this by, for instance, increasing export taxes or some other tax on the beneficiaries of this devaluation. Then people will find more reasonable grounds to protest and demonstrate. So you need to be very careful with the distribution, very careful not only internally, but also in your communication with your constituency.
I remember during my time as a reporter in Argentina covering the last financial crisis, the one in the early 2000s, an economy minister, and I believe it was Jose Luis Machinea, who said that his job was to distribute losses. Which was a bleak way of describing it, but had the ring of truth at the time. I mean, is that going to be Milei's job as well?
Well, as long as we cannot re-engineer growth, we are not growing right now. The only thing that you can distribute is the adjustment, the losses. If you're unable to do that, you don't adjust. And then you stay as you are with your mismatch between resources and spending, and sooner or later you will have another crisis. So you need to adjust in order to avoid the crisis. You need to be politically cunning in order to distribute this in something that is perceived as fair, right? It doesn't matter the way you get there, but it's a mix of distribution and communication. But you have to make sure that people see this as a fair adjustment.
Eduardo, back in June, you wrote what I think was the authoritative piece about this election, not just for us, but in the press generally. The headline was Argentina's election and its Barani moment. And I'd encourage people to go just back and have a peek at that one because there's so much there. We can get into the word Barani here in a moment, but one of the things that you wrote about Milei's election was, you said, voters seem to be resigned, turning the vote into little more than a cathartic gesture. Do you still feel that way now that the election has passed, or do you think that as the election actually happened, some Argentines thought, well, you know what, actually, there might be a plan here, this might work out?
Right after the election, there's always this momentum, this period in which people fall prey to the wishful thinking syndrome and believe that this guy is the guy. This time is different. This guy comes with other ideas and without attachments, which is obviously not true, because has been sponsored and colonized by the establishment as we speak, right? And the names around him are not new names. And with the sponsorship of the right-wing party PRO will be even closer to traditional politics. And that's not a bad thing, but it goes against his campaign and rhetoric. Always when a new guy comes to town, you believe that this guy might be different. I mean, it's obviously a different type of approach. So they're hopeful to some extent. I think that hope will last will be very short-lived if the government doesn't come up with some results, particularly on the nominal stability, say, inflation and exchange rate front. But right now, people, they will have probably the happiest 2 weeks of this government ever.
I laugh because it's, there's a lot of truth to that. And we've seen that again and again in the region with presidents who are elected with high expectations, and their best day in office ends up being their first day because they have so much trouble delivering on expectations. There have been exceptions, and I would cite Lula as one of them, but that has more or less been the pattern. Eduardo, I want to broaden this because you have so many different interests. You have spoken a lot in Argentina and written for us about education. And as we look at the challenges that Argentina faces, of course, it's not just about these basic economic indicators. Now, Argentina is a country that has a proud history, 5 Nobel Prize winners, but we've seen, a steady decline in performance and PISA scores and some of these other educational indicators in recent years. Can you talk to us a little bit about that challenge? Because, as you also noted in our conversation today, human capital is an area where, Argentina does have resources. but they just haven't been able to tap them in a convincing way. How big is the challenge on this front right now?
I think it's the challenge is double because first you need to have a vision as a statesman, as a government. I think Milei doesn't have a clear vision here. He believes in vouchers, he believes in the market, but he's not a specialist, right? He's not someone that can actually tackle the problems of Argentine education. So I'm not very hopeful on the education front because I don't see the trigger for a change. And if we don't change, essentially the situation is one in which we are, imagine a chart with straight lines, we are a flat line. And then we have the neighbors and developing countries that are going up on an upward trend. We started being close to the developed countries, and now we're getting close from the downside to our neighbors. Some of our neighbors have actually overcome us, are even better in terms of standardized tests, but also in terms of education innovation and technology integration and such. So we are losing ground, have been losing ground, and we are losing ground. And what we have is a stock accumulated in the past, but our future doesn't look that bright because what we are doing wrong right now is our future in 10, 20 years' time.
Does that mean that, in your view, Argentina will be, will continue to be a country that relies mostly on its natural resources to prop up the economy?
In the past, we used our education, our good education, to have intellectuals and scientists and also a manufacturing base, which other Latin American countries don't have, except for Brazil and maybe Mexico. So we have been using the fact that we had very early on a broad coverage and a good quality of education. We have been losing that. So we're probably gearing towards being more dependent on natural resources unless we change our human capital policy.
Eduardo, if Argentina is in a better place in 3 years' time, what will have happened?
So many years of bad practices, of mistakes, of squandered opportunities have led us to diverge from our, say, potential path. But those opportunities, not all of them, but many of them are still intact, waiting to be exploited, like natural resources, like human capital already produced. Some of them has been migrating abroad but can come back. Our savings, I mentioned that before. So we have opportunities we haven't been exploiting. So ordering the economy, reducing vulnerability, introducing some certainty in terms of what's going to happen in 2-3 years' time in exchange rate, in rules, in laws, in taxes, would have led, in our view, to a rebound place. So ordering the economy already generates, in this particular case, it's not general, in this particular case, a trickle down in terms of opportunities that start to materialize, even without a lot of public sector intervention, just being normal again. Then you have to grow, right? But the rebound gives you the growth that you need to have political support to introduce the next wave of reforms. But first you have to order the house, shape up your economy.
A final question for you, Eduardo. It's a political question that goes to the heart of that scenario that you just drew out. Is there a road to governability? That question assumes it's not endorsing any particular platform. It's not assuming that Javier Milei is going to come out of this with this whole process of forming his cabinet with the best plan, but at least presumably he will have a plan. And we've already seen how, to take one example, the head of the union at Aerolíneas Argentinas said in recent days, well, they'll have to kill us in order to do what they want to do and privatize sectors of the economy. He later backtracked and said that was not the right choice of words, but it was a sign of what all of us sense, which is that Milei's going to face resistance on the streets from day one. Is there a path where, given the precarious nature of his support in Congress and the effervescence, let's say, of the Argentine street, where any of this can come to fruition?
Well, here we have to say very precise when we talk about governability, because our problems are not the same as Peru, in the sense of meaning, you can impeach a president, you can put him to jail, you can't govern Congress, we have a very strong democracy, stronger than people believe. So certain things, I believe, certainly cannot be done. You cannot tweak with the system too much, even though the president has a lot of power. So having said that, we will have demonstrations because it's a very vocal economy. So we will have demonstrations either way. So there are two things that you have to separate to see the difference. People in the streets, yes, you have to learn to live with that. And in Argentina, it's very difficult because our police is, like in Chile, is a very blunt object that you cannot use liberally. And we have a history of political violence that we cannot ignore. So that's important. And that's where communication, and that's where the balance has to be found. But lack of governability is not being able to do anything. And that's the main risk for Milei, is being a Pedro Castillo. With the exception that Pedro Castillo lived in a stabilized country, was investment grade, where we need badly to stabilize our markets and recover our market access. So, but you see, I'm not afraid of Pablo Viró, the guy that you mentioned before. Actually, he backtracked. People told him that that's not the way. I'm afraid of paralysis.
Tell me, do you see Congress willing to play ball with him?
One of the things that some people are starting to complain about regarding Milei is that he's a joining reference of the casta, of the old the traditional political class. But that's actually a good thing from his governability perspective, because these guys are actually trying to negotiate a deal, not with the right-wing party, which is already in, but with the Peronist party, the non-Kirchnerist, the non-extremist, the center-right Peronist party, that will have a lot of representatives in Congress and senators in the Senate. And they're moving in that direction. They're thinking of naming a Peronist as the speaker of the government's bloc, the government's group of representatives. And so they're showing some more street smarts than the original libertarian speech was insinuating, by trying to, gather some support. Will they be able to do that? Well, this is a bi-directional thing. If you are successful in the first measure, if what you do at the beginning looks like it might have some, chances of success, people and company will follow because you don't want to be on the other side. Now, I'm afraid that at the time of the first mishap, the first strong sign of resistance, the firm's mistake, all these guys are now so constructively joining, or at least the offering assistance, will rapidly move to the other hand and say, we have midterm elections in 2 years, we're going to war. But that's, as I say, it's endogenous, because if you're successful, you will have that support. And if you're not, you will have everybody on the other side. I think they are not trying to build a coalition. They're actually trying to get the votes in Congress, which is something completely different. They're not asking Peronists to go to the cabinet. What you need is to talk with a representative. You need to ensure that he gets the fiscal transfers he needs. So it's a different type of negotiation. But you don't need a coalition. You need a tit-for-tat type of negotiation with fiscal funds, fiscal resources that will be incredibly scarce.
Well, a long path ahead with all its complexities, and I feel like you've done so much today to help us understand what some of those complexities are. So, Eduardo, thank you as always for joining us here on the podcast.
No, it was a big pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced by Luisa Franco and edited in partnership with Human Group Media.